Think about what is protecting your body right now. Not your faith, not your prayer practice, not the medications in your cabinet, or the food you choose carefully at the market. The architecture of protection your body built over decades. The biological, neurological, and spiritual defenses that stand between you and what should not enter. The system your body assembled, layer by layer, through every year of your life, to keep out what it learned to recognize as dangerous. Think about when that architecture was at its strongest. Your 30s, perhaps your 40s. That period when the body was not only healthy, but fortified in a way you likely never thought about, because you never had reason to. Because the system was working so well you could not feel it working. Now think about this. There is a threshold age at which that architecture begins to change. Not simply weaken in the way aging weakens muscle or bone. Change its character, open gaps that were not there before. Alter, in a measurable and specific way, the relationship between your body and the forces, biological, spiritual, or both, that are always, without ceasing, testing what you are built to withstand. Solomon knew this threshold. He identified it with the precision of a physician. He wrote about it in 12 verses that have been sitting in the most widely read book in human history for 3,000 years. And almost everyone who has read those 12 verses has missed what he was actually saying. Tonight, I want to show you what he saw. Let me read you the 12th chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes. Not the way it is usually read, not the poetic Sunday school version, the meditation on aging and impermanence, the beautiful literary image of life's inevitable decline. I want to read it the way the ancient rabbis actually read it, the way scholars in Talmud Shabbat, Tractate 151 through 152 read it. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta, the Talmudic tradition that preserved this reading before it was buried under 2,000 years of liturgical softening. As a medical text, an organ-by-organ diagnostic manual for what happens to the human body as it approaches its final decades. Coded in metaphor, deliberately, probably to preserve precise anatomical knowledge in a form that could survive censorship and casual misreading across millennia, but not metaphor for its own sake, clinical description. Listen to verse 1 carefully. Not for its moral instruction, for its timing. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 1. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth before the evil days come. The Hebrew word translated as evil days is ra. It does not mean morally evil. It means days of hardship, days of physical diminishment, days when the body begins to fail the tasks it once performed without effort. And the phrase "before the evil days come" is not a spiritual urgency. It is a medical one. There is a window for fortification. The window does not stay open indefinitely. Begin before the architecture begins to change. Solomon is not asking you to remember God because it is the right thing to do. He is telling you that the timing of the practice is part of the practice. Now verse 3, in the day when the keepers of the house tremble, the keepers of the house. Talmud Shabbat 151b, Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta leaves no ambiguity. The keepers of the house are the arms and hands, the guardians of the body's physical frame, trembling, losing their grip, developing the involuntary shaking that marks the body's loss of steady command over its own structure. When was the last time anyone told you that verse 3 of Ecclesiastes 12 was a clinical description of hand tremors in aging adults? And the strong men are bent. The strong men, the thighs and legs, the structural pillars of the human body losing their ability to hold the frame upright. Stooped gait, the grasshopper that drags itself along, not random imagery, a specific, identifiable symptom of muscular and skeletal aging. And the grinders cease because they are few. The grinders, the molars, the grinding teeth that do the heavy work of digestion, falling out, becoming few. An organ-specific detail of extraordinary precision that makes no sense as random metaphor and perfect sense as a physician working through a systematic checklist. Those who look through the windows see dimly. The windows, the eyes. Talmudic consensus is unanimous. The windows through which we see the world, failing, dimming, requiring correction where they once required nothing. When the doors on the street are shut, and the sound of the grinding is low. The doors are the ears, the outer mechanism by which sound enters the body, shutting, reducing, losing their capacity to register what is happening in the world around you. The voice growing thin, the world not quieter, but the apparatus of hearing beginning to close. The almond tree blossoms, white hair. The almond tree in winter produces white blossoms before any other tree. Solomon chose this image specifically. The cold season flowering of white, the head in old age, and the caper berry has no effect. This detail is the one that stops me every time. In antiquity, the caper berry was used as an aphrodisiac. Solomon is describing with extraordinary clinical specificity the loss of appetite and desire in old age. Not vaguely, not poetically, by the specific botanical substance that had been used to restore what time removes. This is not a poem. This is a physician at work. Verse 6. The silver cord is snapped. The golden bowl is broken. The Talmud in Shabbat 152 identifies the silver cord as the spinal cord, the neural thread that connects the body's command system to its extremities. The golden bowl, the skull, the casing of the brain. When the cord snaps, communication fails. When the bowl breaks, what was held inside it disperses. Solomon was mapping the human body's deterioration in precise anatomical sequence. But he was not mapping it to frighten you. He was mapping it because what he had understood about the deterioration, what he had identified about the specific vulnerability that each stage of decline creates, was knowledge that most people in his time, and in ours, were never being given. He was mapping it because the physician who diagnoses accurately gives you time to respond. And Solomon had identified something specific about what the deterioration opens. I want to tell you what neuroscience has confirmed about this in the last 10 years. In 2013, Dr. Maiken Nedergaard at the University of Rochester published research describing a network inside the brain that had been largely overlooked. She called it the glymphatic system, not a metaphor, a literal network operating primarily during deep sleep that clears the brain of metabolic waste. Toxic proteins, cellular debris, the accumulation that builds up in neural tissue during waking hours. The brain, during deep slow-wave sleep, essentially washes itself. The glymphatic channels expand during that sleep, allowing cerebrospinal fluid to flush through the tissue and carry the waste products away. When this system works well, the brain clears. When it degrades, the waste accumulates, the proteins associated with Alzheimer's disease. The debris researchers see elevated in Parkinson's, the biological correlates of neurodegeneration. Studies published between 2021 and 2024 have confirmed something specific about the timeline of this degradation. The glymphatic system's efficiency begins to decline measurably in the mid-50s. The brain's own internal clearance mechanism, its primary internal guardian, begins to tremble, to lose its grip, to no longer hold the perimeter with the same certainty it held at 40. Now, reread Solomon, the keepers of the house tremble. He was not writing about the hands. He was writing about every guardian of the body's architecture, including the ones no one in his time had the instruments to name, but whose function he understood with the precision of a man who had been given, as the book of 1 Kings chapter 3 verse 12 records, wisdom that no one before him had been given and no one after him would receive. 3,000 years before the University of Rochester, 3,000 years before the studies on glymphatic degradation, the keepers of the house, the brain's guardians, trembling. Now I want to take you to the Testament of Solomon. Chapter 18. The 36 Decan Spirits. This is not mythology in the way casual readers dismiss it. Charles McCown's critical scholarly edition, published in 1922, drawing on Greek manuscript traditions going back to the early medieval period, established it as a systematic record of considerable intellectual sophistication. The 36 Decan spirits claim dominion over specific bodily ailments. Each one rules a particular disease, a particular physical system, a particular point of human vulnerability. And the pattern across all 36 is what matters tonight. They do not attack the fortified, they attack the weakened. Cruicus operates through the head. Cerebral pressure, the kind that becomes something more serious when the body's defenses are already compromised. Oropel targets the throat, creating unquenchable thirst, a symptom disproportionately common in the elderly, whose bodies have lost some of their ability to regulate fluid efficiently. Mardero brings fever and disease that the text specifically describes as incurable, the category of illness that takes hold when resistance has already failed. The Testament's underlying logic is not that these entities are more powerful than the human body, it is that they are opportunistic. They find the gap. They enter through what has opened. And after the age of 50, after the architecture begins to change in the ways Solomon catalogued in Ecclesiastes 12, the gaps are different, larger, more accessible to what has been patient. This is not frightening if you take it the way Solomon intended it. It is a diagnostic. Know where the gaps open. Know what enters through them. Know the counter before you need it, because Solomon left the counter. That is the part most people have never been told. Now let me take you west, across to the Yoruba and Igbo traditions of Nigeria. Because what I have just described, the glymphatic decline after 50, the decan spirits finding the weakened, is not a Jewish or Western framework. It is a convergence point. The Yoruba concept of Ori. Your Ori is your spiritual head, your personal guardian chosen before birth that accompanies you through every day of your life. The Ori mediates between you and the divine. It stands between you and what would harm you. It carries the specific quality of protection that is uniquely yours. And the Ifa corpus, the vast tradition of Yoruba divination wisdom that is among the oldest oral and textual archives in West Africa, contains a specific acknowledgement about what happens to the Ori across the span of a life. The Ori does not weaken in wisdom with age, but it becomes thinner, not less wise, more permeable. Like cloth that has been worn through many seasons, it remains the same cloth. It carries the same history, but the weave is not as tight as it was in the early years. What once would not have passed through can now find the gaps. The Ogunda Meji corpus, one of the 16 foundational Odu of the Ifa divination system, contains prescriptions specifically for those entering the 7th decade. Igbo ritual renewal, the proactive restoration of the Ori's protective force, performed before the thinning becomes dangerous. And the tradition behind this practice is not pessimistic, it is practical. The Ori thins. You renew it before the thinning becomes critical. This is maintenance, not mourning. The Quran, when it speaks of the body, returns to the same principle from a different direction. Surah Al-Baqarah describes the human being as a trust holder, the body given as an amana, a sacred trust from God to be preserved and tended. The Islamic medical tradition that grew from the teachings of the Prophet understood that this trust requires specific ongoing acts of maintenance, not emergency repair, continuous care. Because the body held in trust must be accounted for at the end, and negligence of the trust is not spiritually neutral. 3 traditions. 1 principle. The architecture requires maintenance before the structure is compromised. And Solomon, in Ecclesiastes 12 verse 1, said precisely when the maintenance matters most. Before the evil days come, now let me give you the counter-protocol. Because the promise I made to you is not only a warning. Solomon did not leave you with a diagnosis and no prescription. He left the prescription in 4 specific places, and they are precise. The first element is in Ecclesiastes 12, verse 1 itself. Remember your Creator before the evil days come. This is a medical instruction about timing. The Solomonic principle, consistent with the Yoruba Ori prescription in Ogunda Meji, consistent with the glymphatic evidence that the system begins its degradation in the mid-50s, is this. The window for proactive spiritual fortification does not stay fully open indefinitely. If you are under 50, Solomon's instruction is clear. Begin now. Not when you feel the need. Now when the architecture is still strong. The fortification built into strong architecture holds differently than the fortification attempted after the walls have already begun to crack. If you are past 50, the instruction is not different in kind. It is different in urgency. The window is not closed. It is narrower than it was, and narrower is not the same as closed. Begin now, today, not with a one-time act, but with a daily discipline that does not wait for emergency. Because the Solomonic principle is that the protection works best when it is built continuously, not summoned only when the crisis has already arrived. The second element is in Proverbs 17, verse 22. A cheerful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. In Solomon's framework, this is not a pleasantry about positive thinking. It is a structural claim about the connection between the inner life and the physical immune system. The bones in ancient Jewish understanding, confirmed by multiple Talmudic passages that connect this verse to the function of bone marrow, are the seat of vitality. Modern immunology confirms it. Bone marrow produces white blood cells, the primary fighters of the immune system. A crushed spirit dries up the bones, the same Hebrew verb used to describe what happens to a river during drought. When the spirit is chronically depleted, when the inner life is sustained by nothing that genuinely replenishes it, when grief or despair become the water the soul drinks daily, Solomon says this is not merely a spiritual condition, it is a physical one. The immune system dries. The counter is not a cure, it is daily maintenance, deliberate, sustained engagement with what genuinely replenishes the inner life. Not occasional gratitude, not emergency prayer when the crisis arrives. Continuous practice, sustained before the drying begins, maintained through the years when the architecture is most at risk. The third element comes from the Testament's logic. Solomon catalogued every decan spirit with a specific question. What defeats you? Not a general spiritual protection, a specific counter, an angel's name, a material, a practice, a time. The practical instruction from this is direct. If there is something specific in your body or your inner life that does not resolve, a darkness that arrives at a particular time, a vulnerability under particular conditions, do not address it generally. Name it specifically. Identify how it enters. Find what defeats it specifically. General protection is less effective than targeted counter. This was Solomon's clinical position, applied 72 times across 25 chapters of the Testament. The pattern does not change because the century does. The fourth element is the convergence that I find most remarkable. The glymphatic system clears the brain during deep sleep. Solomon's bedtime protocol, the night sealing practice I have described in detail in earlier videos, is not separate from this mechanism. It is the same mechanism. When Solomon prescribed specific spiritual preparation before sleep, the declaration of protection, the sealing of the sleeping space, the conscious alignment before unconsciousness, he was prescribing protection for the precise window during which the brain's physical defense system does its primary work. The spiritual and the physical converge at exactly the same hour, deep sleep. What you bring into the last moments before sleep is not preparation only for a spiritual event. It is the entry condition for a biological one. Treat the preparation for sleep as seriously as you would treat any other form of medical preparation. Because Solomon understood 3,000 years before the glymphatic research that the night has a structure. The guardians of the body's internal architecture need that structure to be protected. And protecting the night is not metaphor. It is maintenance of the same system that was failing in the people he was describing in Ecclesiastes 12. Seal the night. Not because the darkness is an enemy, because the body's guardians need the night to do their work. Now I need to tell you about my father. His name is Chukwuemeka. He spent 40 years as a historian of ancient religions at University College London. He is the reason I know how to construct an argument, how to weigh evidence, how to interrogate a text without sentimentality. He is also the reason I spent the first decade of my research career dismissing the very knowledge I now spend most of my life trying to recover. My father was a brilliant, skeptical man who had built his career on the proposition that rigorous scholarship required a strict separation from personal belief. He understood the Igbo spiritual practices my mother maintained in our household during my childhood in Nsukka, understood them academically with genuine intellectual respect, and privately regarded them as unscientific. He loved my mother. He did not practice what she practiced. 2 years before I began the research that would eventually become this channel, my father had a stroke. He was 68 years old. It was not catastrophic. Not the kind that ends everything in a single night, but it was enough to change him. He became slower, confused sometimes in the evenings, in a way that frightened not because the confusion was severe, but because it was new. He had been a man of relentless precision. Suddenly the precision was not always there when he reached for it, and something else appeared. He became frightened in ways he had never been frightened before. Not of physical things, of something less nameable. The man who had spent 4 decades studying fear in ancient religious texts as an intellectual phenomenon was now experiencing something he did not have the vocabulary for. I flew to Ibadan. I sat with him in the hospital, a clean modern hospital, and for a long time he said very little. Then he asked me something I was not prepared for. He said, "Do you think the ancestors can hear?" This man, this UCL academic, this man who had spent 4 decades explaining to students why rational historiography required not assuming the answers that indigenous cosmology assumed. He asked me whether the ancestors could hear him. He was asking because he had run out of his own answers, because the stroke had opened something in him, some awareness of a threshold he had not previously admitted existed, and he was standing at it without the tools he needed. He had arrived at 68, asking the question his mother and grandmother had been answering all along. I did not know what to say. I was 40 years old, deep into my research on Solomonic texts. I had been sitting with Ecclesiastes 12 for months, working through the medical allegory, trying to understand why Solomon had chosen to code a clinical description of bodily decline in the language of an abandoned house. And my father, lying in a hospital in Ibadan, was asking me whether the ancestors could hear him. I gave him the only honest answer I could. I said, "I don't know, but I think Solomon thought carefully about this." And I opened Ecclesiastes 12 and read it to him, not the Sunday school version, the medical allegory, the keepers of the house trembling, the strong men bent, the grinders that cease, the windows dimmed, the doors shut, the silver cord about to snap. I read him the diagnostic manual that Solomon had encoded in 12 verses for exactly the person my father was in that moment, a person sitting at the threshold that Solomon had mapped with such extraordinary precision. My father was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "He was describing me, wasn't he?" "Yes. 3,000 years ago, organ by organ, in code." My father was quiet again. Then he said something I have been sitting with ever since. He said, "Why didn't anyone tell me sooner?" He did not mean why had no one explained the medical allegory. He meant the other thing. Solomon's instruction in verse 1. Before the evil days come, the prescription that precedes the entire catalogue of decline. The timing that is the counter-protocol's most important element. He had reached 68 before he asked the right question, and the right question had been sitting in a text he had studied academically for 40 years, not as instruction, as literature. My father recovered slowly. He still lives in Ibadan. He is different from the man he was before the stroke, but he is not broken. And sometimes when I call him, he tells me he has started practicing something quietly without ceremony. He does not call it the Solomonic counter-protocol. He calls it what his mother would have called it, and I think Solomon would have recognized both names, because the mechanism does not change depending on what language you use to describe it. What I want to leave you with is this. Ecclesiastes 12 verse 1 was not written for people who were already at the threshold. It was written for people who still had time. Solomon knew the schedule. He had mapped it with more precision than anyone else in his tradition. He knew approximately when the keepers of the house begin to tremble, when the windows begin to dim, when the glymphatic guardians begin their measurable decline. And he wrote verse 1 before verse 3. Before the evil days come. That is not accident. That is instruction. The counter-protocol is most effective when it is built into the architecture before the architecture begins to change, not because the doors close after 50. But because the foundation laid at 35 is deeper than the foundation laid at 68. My father was 68 when he lay in a hospital in Ibadan and asked whether the ancestors could hear him. He had needed to ask that question at 30, he is asking it now. And Solomon would say that is not too late. But do not misunderstand. Solomon would also say do not wait. The evil days have a schedule. You are not exempt from the schedule, but you have something my father did not have in that hospital room. You have the diagnosis before the symptoms arrived. You have the medical allegory decoded. You have the counter-protocol named. You have verse 1 before verse 3. What you do with that is yours. Ask yourself tonight, honestly and without sentiment, what the architecture of your protection actually looks like. Not what you believe about it. What it is. The daily practice. The state of the inner life. Whether the spirit is being replenished or allowed to dry. Whether the night is being prepared for or simply fallen into. Solomon spent 12 verses mapping what happens when those questions go unanswered for too long. He spent verse 1 telling you exactly when to answer them. The answer he was waiting for is not a one-time decision. It is a daily discipline, built before it is needed, maintained long after you stop feeling the urgency to build it. 3,000 years accurate, still accurate to the day.